I-485, which is the application for adjustment of status, also known as the green card application. The expiration date for this form currently is February 28th, 2026, and the edition date, which can be found at the bottom of this form, is February 21st, 2023. Like with any USCIS form, you should always be using the most updated form. Even though they usually say that they have a leniency period where they still accept old edition or expiration date of the forms, I personally always recommend before sending out your applications to make sure that your application matches the application version available on the USCIS site. And if it's not, it's always safe to refill it to a new expiration and edition date. If any sections of the form you are unable to fill out on your computer, you can always fill them in using a black pen after you print your form. Please make sure that if you are using a pen though, that you are doing it very neatly. So let's get started. You can skip past this first part of the form since it is only for USCIS use. You can also skip this little part, which is only for your lawyer or legal representative or preparer to use. And you as an applicant can start right here. First and foremost, if you already have a number, you should absolutely fill it in on your paperwork, even if it is an A number obtained through a different prior case. And you will notice that once you fill in the A number here, it will be automatically filled in at the top of each page of this application. And once again, if you are unable to do it using your computer, you can always neatly fill it in pen after printing. If you don't have an A number, you can simply leave this area blank. Also, you're not required to use N/A in parts of the applications that do not apply to you, and it has been officially confirmed by USCIS on their own YouTube channel that blanks and NA are both acceptable. The first part of the form is all information about the person applying for permanent residence. And here you will need to provide their current legal name. Sometimes I get asked if middle name also includes patronyms. This is solely up to you. You may choose to use your patronym as your middle name, or you may simply leave it blank if you don't have a middle name. In addition, I often get a question if this should be your married name if you, for example, changed your name after marriage. If you did change your name after marriage, then your married name is your current legal name, which you should be using here. You should also keep all of these names consistent across all of your USCIS applications. But even if you were unable to change your last name on your marriage certificate because your state doesn't allow it, you're still allowed to use your spouse's last name on your USCIS applications. Moving on, here you will need to provide any other names you have ever used since birth. Here you will need to provide names that you have used on other documents, identity documents, and applications, and your maiden name. Even if you have different variations of how you spell your name, you should also be indicating it here, as it will help with better running your background check. If you run out of space in these three subsections here, you can always go back to part 14 of the form and fill in the remaining names here. Moving on, provide your date of birth here. Next, provide your sex and city and town of birth. Moving on, provide your country of birth and provide your country of citizenship and nationality. If you have more than one citizenship or nationality, you may also utilize Part 14 additional information to provide additional nationalities. USCIS states, here you should be providing the citizenship of the country from the passport that you used to enter the United States or apply for a US visa. Next, provide your A number if you haven't already. It was automatically filled in here. If you have ever been assigned any other A numbers, once again, you should also be filling that information in the Part 14 additional information. Next, let's talk about USCIS account number. This account number is only assigned to someone if they have ever submitted any online USCIS applications. If you do not know your online account number, that is perfectly fine. You can leave this blank. They will make their best effort to find your name and email associated with an already existing USCIS online account. You should not be including the petitioner's online account here, as typically beneficiary and petitioner are expected to have different USCIS online accounts. Moving on, provide your US mailing address. You can completely skip this in care of name line. You will only have to fill in this line if somebody else will be receiving mail on your behalf. Let's say, for example, you do not actually reside at your mailing address. So here you can provide the name of the person who resides at this mailing address, whom you allow to receive your important immigration mail on your behalf. If you reside at your mailing address, you can absolutely leave this line blank. Moving on, you will need to provide a safe or alternative mailing address if you're applying based on VAWA or T or U visas. If, however, you are applying based on employment, diversity, family petition, then in this case, you can simply leave this whole subsection blank. Moving on, the first question asks if you have ever been given a social security card. If you have ever lived and worked in the United States with authorization, then you probably have a social security card already. If you have never lived or worked in the United States before and never applied for a social security number, then you will simply have to answer no and skip questions 15 through 17. But let's say, for example, we have had a social security number before that was issued to us through OPT. Provide the number here. And the next question asks if you would like the Social Security Administration to issue you a Social Security card. This is not asking if you want a new Social Security number. This is asking if you want a new card. If you don't want a new card, you can click no. If you maybe misplaced your card and you would like to receive a new one, then you will have to answer yes. If you answer yes, then you will also have to answer question 17. But if we answered no, we can simply skip question 17. Moving on. Here it's asking us about our most recent immigration history. So first, provide the passport number that was used at last arrival. If you last arrived in the United States many years ago and your passport and both your visa have already expired, you still need to be providing the passport number that was used at your most recent arrival to the United States. The next question asks about a travel document number. So typically, the passport and the travel document are considered mutually exclusive. In some cases, people who come to the United States don't need to use a passport. They can, for example, use a travel document such as a border crossing card. Or if you were a refugee and you used a refugee travel document, then you will enter the number here in the travel document section. But if you only entered on a passport and never used any other travel document, then you can simply skip question 19. Please note that the travel document number is not asking for your visa number. Your visa number will be asked in the questions a little bit later. Next, provide the expiration date of your passport, the country that issued your passport, and here it's asking for the non-immigrant visa number from this passport. Typically, the non-immigrant visa number is the red number at the bottom right corner of your visa. If you cannot locate your visa number or you simply don't know what it is, you can leave this question blank. Next, you are asked to provide the place of your last arrival to the United States. So here you will enter the information of the city where you actually landed and was admitted into the United States. If, for example, you landed in the United States in New York, JF Kennedy, but then you also had layover flights to your final destination, here you will need to provide the port of arrival, which means the JFK airport will be your initial arrival to the United States. And provide the date of your most recent arrival. Moving on. On this next page, you are asked what your status was when you last arrived to the United States, which means when you most recently arrived to the United States. Most applicants will probably select question 25A, which means that you were inspected at a port of entry and admitted on a visa. So let's say, for example, that Jane was inspected, which means you actually had your passport looked at by the immigration, and she was admitted as an F1 student. So we simply have to write student. Another question that I frequently get, what happens if I arrived on a visa waiver program, for example? Then here you can simply write visa waiver. If, for example, you arrived in the United States on a parole program such as the humanitarian parole program that is currently running for Cuba, Venezuela, Ukraine, then you can enter it here. Moving on, if you were issued a form I-94, then you will have to fill in this information here. I know that this can be difficult for people who entered on a visa waiver program. However, even if you did, you are likely to still be able to obtain your I-94 on the Customs and Border Patrol website. If you are unsure, you still may be able to contact the Customs and Border Patrol and request that information from them. And even if you have overstayed your visa for a long time, for many years, for example, a lot of applicants are still able to obtain their I-94 information online. So provide your form I-94 arrival departure record number. Provide the expiration date of authorized stay shown on the form I-94. You can here type in the date that is indicated on your form I-94. But if, for example, you entered on a student visa, very frequently your I-94 will say D/S, known as duration of stay. And so in a lot of cases, you won't be able to fill in DS in the form while you're filling it out on your computer, but you can absolutely write it in after you print the form. Next, question 26C asks about the status on your I-94. You will need to provide exactly what was your class of admission. If you had a class of admission F1 on your I-94, that is exactly what you're going to write here. If you entered on a tourist visa, for example, you may have to write B1 or B2. Or if you were on a visa waiver program, for example, sometimes your class of admission will be listed as WT. And then you will need to answer a question about your current immigration status. And if your status has not changed since you arrived on this status, if it's still valid, for example, it's still unexpired, then you can simply leave this question blank. But let's say, for example, you did enter on some kind of visa and it expired, but you're still in the United States and now applying for adjustment of status, then you can write, for example, out of status, or you can write visa overstay. You can write, for example, something like pending asylum. Or if you were in a situation where you arrived on one type of visa, but then you applied for a different type of visa that is actually approved and active, then you can also write it here. For example, your status changed from student to temporary protected status. If you, for example, applied for a visa extension, but it hasn't been approved yet, and your previous visa actually expired, you would still have to write that you are out of status. Next, you will need to provide your name exactly as it appears on your I-94. And let's say, for example, that in our case, when Jane arrived in the United States on her most recent student visa, she still used her maiden name. Moving on. In part 2, you're now being asked about your filing category. In our case, we are applying based on the I-130 family petition. So we can select, for example, a spouse of a U.S. citizen. That puts us in the immediate relative of U.S. citizen category. The immediate relatives of U.S. citizens are spouses, parents, and unmarried children under the age of 21 of U.S. citizens. Any other relative would fall under the second box right here. If you are a derivative applicant on any of these categories, you will still have to select the category that fits the primary applicant. Moving on. The question 2 in part 2 is very important, and this one asks if you're applying for adjustment of status based on the INA section 245I. Now, I already have a short video on YouTube explaining how to answer this question. It is very likely that you will answer no to this question simply because the section 245I applies to a very small number of applicants. Moving on. Next, you will need to provide the information about your immigrant category. So this one makes a distinction about principal applicant and derivative applicant. Now, if you are an immediate relative of a US citizen, you will only have to fill out this top part. And that is only if you already sent in your I-130 petition. For instance, you applied for the I-130 online and instantly received a receipt number from filing that I-130 application, then you can go ahead and provide that receipt number here. And the priority date, typically for immediate relatives of US citizens, it will be the date on which you actually submitted the I-130 application. I highly encourage you to review a video that I made which describes in detail who is considered a principal and who is considered a derivative applicant. Not every immigration category allows you to have derivative applicants. Regardless of whether you are a principal or a derivative applicant, you will each have to fill out your own Form I-485 in order to apply for a green card. If you are only the principal applicant on the case, then you will only need to fill in this top part right here. If you are a derivative applicant, leave the top part blank and provide the information in this bottom half right here. So for example, if you won a diversity visa, you won green card lottery, as the principal person who actually entered in the lottery and won, you will have to provide your priority date and information here in the top part. And then your spouse and children, for example, on their each respective I-485 applications, will have to answer these questions about you, the principal applicant, in their own respective I-485 applications, and they would leave this top part blank. Moving on to part 3. Here you're asked if you have ever applied for an immigrant visa at a US embassy or consulate overseas. Now, this question doesn't ask if you have ever applied for any kind of visa overseas. This only asks if you have ever applied for a green card through a US embassy or consulate. In a lot of cases, applicants who are adjusting status will probably answer no. Moving on, here you will be asked to provide your address history for the last 5 years, and you will need to provide your current address first. If you run out of space, you can always use Part 14, additional information, to provide the remaining addresses. So let's fill in our current address, and we'll say, for example, that our current address actually is the exact same as our current mailing address. Then you will need to provide the dates from when you lived at this address. So we still have 3 years worth of address history to fill out. Now you will need to provide the dates where you lived at this other address that was second to last, which means the address directly before your present address. So this part of the address history only gives us space to provide 2 addresses. Well, in that case, we're going to scroll to the last page of this form to fill in this information. Here we will need to fill in page number 5, part number 3, and we could say physical address 3. And now here you can fill in the other address information before our second most recent address. So this is our third most recent address. So we're still not complete with 5 years history. So we're going to fill in the other physical address, which you can fill in the same little box, or you can move down to this box. But I always try to fill in as much information as possible because there's a possibility that there will be other information that we will have to fill in here. So let's say, for example, that in our fourth most recent address, which will complete our 5-year history, Jane actually lived here since her birth in 1990 all the way until 2019. Now we can be sure that our address history for the past 5 years is complete. If we move on to this subsection of the address history, which asks us to provide the most recent address outside of the United States, where you lived for more than 1 year, if not already listed above. Because we have already filled in that foreign address as our additional information, we can leave it blank. But you also will not be penalized if you decide to include that foreign address here one more time. Moving on, now you will need to provide your employment history also for the last 5 years, whether inside or outside the United States. I often get a question, what happens if I am currently unemployed, but should I type in here that I am actually unemployed, or should I use my most recent employment before I became unemployed? So the form kind of leaves it up to you. You can either indicate that you are currently unemployed. You can also go ahead and just include the most recent place of employment before you became unemployed, for example. I always like to type in the information as it is currently at the moment of submitting these applications. So in this personal example, I'm going to write that Jane is unemployed. If, for example, you are a student, then you can write, for example, unemployed dash student. Or if you are retired, you can also write unemployed dash retired, or simply student. It is really all up to you. If you are, for example, a student, then you can fill in student and then provide your university or college address here. The other two questions that I often get, number one is if I am a student, but I'm also getting paid because I'm on an internship or I work for my college, should I write my employment information here? The answer is yes, absolutely. If you are getting paid, even if it's just a part-time job, a student job, an internship, you still have to say that you are employed and provide all of that information here. The other question I get is, if I am employed under the table and the job is not official, should I still indicate that here? And the answer is probably yes. Of course, you will need to analyze your own immigration circumstance when filling out this paperwork. But for instance, if you are employed illegally, but you are an immediate spouse of a US citizen, your unauthorized employment will be forgiven just on the basis of your immediate relationship to a US citizen. So you could still safely indicate that employment in this section. As you can see, this form also will not let us fill in the word current or present in this section, and you can do that on your own after printing using a black pen. Next, you will need to provide the information of your second most recent employer, whether, again, it is outside or inside the United States. If you have more employers to indicate here, then you can use this additional information page to fill that in. Going back to the employment history, you will also be asked to provide your most recent employment outside of the United States, again, if not already listed above. But in our case, for example, Jane was actually unemployed when she lived in Russia. And so we don't have to fill in anything here. And again, we can leave the rest of these blank. Moving on to part 4, here it asks information about the parents of the person applying for a green card. It doesn't matter which parent you're filling in first, mother or father. Once you fill in this information, you can move on to the next page, and this part of the parent history asks if the parent is still living where they're currently residing. Moving on, provide information about your second parent. So let's say this will be Jane's mother. Let's say that Jane's mother also had a maiden name prior to marrying Jane's father, so we'll provide her maiden name here. And let's say, for example, that Jane's mother actually is no longer living. So in this case, you can simply leave questions 15 and 16 either completely blank, or you can, for example, write deceased in this question if the parent is no longer living. Some people ask if they actually don't know the name of their biological parent, should they still write it here? You can simply write unknown in any of these sections. Same applies for a date of birth. If you truly don't know the date of birth of your parent, then you can leave this blank or write unknown. Moving on, provide the information on your marital history. Let's say Jane is applying based on the marriage to a US citizen, so she will obviously have to answer that she is married. If this is a green card application for a minor child, then in that case, you would simply select that they're single and were never married. If you are married, is your spouse a current member of U.S. Armed Forces or Coast Guard? You will simply have to yes, no, or not applicable. We'll say no, for example. Moving on, this question trips up a lot of people that ask, how many times have you been married, including annulled marriages and marriages to the same person? You do have to count in the current marriage as well. So it's not asking how many times you've been married before your current spouse. This is asking how many times you have ever been married. So let's say, for example, in Jane's situation, she actually has been married twice. Next, you are asked to provide the information about your current marriage. You will provide your current spouse's name. And let's say that Jack is a US citizen and he probably doesn't have an A number, because if Jack was born in the United States, he wouldn't have an A number. But let's say, for example, Jack is a naturalized US citizen. Should we include his alien number that was listed on his naturalization certificate? And the answer is always yes. Just because you are a naturalized citizen, you still have to include all the information down to your A number. Next, provide the spouse's date of birth. What an interesting family. All of us have the same birthday. And next, you will need to provide the date of marriage to your current spouse. Moving on. Provide your current spouse's place of birth. You're allowed to write United States, USA, same for states. You're allowed to write out the full name of the state or an abbreviation. Next, provide the place of marriage to the current spouse. And now, this question also causes confusion for a lot of people. Is your current spouse applying with you? Now, this question specifically asks if your spouse is applying for a green card based on your green card application. If your spouse is already a US citizen or a permanent resident, the answer will always be no. If you are applying for a green card for any other reason, employment, asylum, diversity, whatever, and your spouse is considered your derivative and they will be applying for a green card together with you, then you will answer yes. Just because your spouse is involved in your green card process or he's your petitioner, it doesn't mean that they are applying with us. So in most circumstances, the question will be no, unless, like I said, your spouse is your derivative. Moving on, here you will need to provide information about your prior marriages. You will need to provide the prior spouse's date of birth and when Jane actually got married to this prior spouse, where Jane got married to this prior spouse, and when exactly this marriage was legally ended, which means when the divorce was officially finalized. If, for example, your prior spouse is actually deceased, then in the space which asks when the marriage legally ended, you will write the date of death of that prior spouse. And lastly, you will also need to provide where this marriage actually ended. Moving on, Section 6 asks about our children. In our case, let's say, for example, that Jane doesn't actually have any children, so we can either write 0 or we can actually in pen later after printing write none in this section. Please note that the term children, as they noted here, includes all biological or legally adopted children and stepchildren of any age born inside or outside the United States, married or unmarried, etc. All living children. If you are applying on the basis of marriage to a citizen, for example, and your US citizen spouse has underage children, even if they don't live with you, they're still considered your stepchildren by USCIS definitions. We're not going to say that Jane has any children, but I do want to pay your attention to this particular question. Is this child applying with you? Just like on the previous page, which gave us the same question for our spouse, this question means the same thing. If the child is a principal applicant on their own green card application, the answer will be no. If the child is a derivative based on your own green card application, then you will answer yes. So for example, if you are a spouse of a US citizen and your US citizen spouse is also petitioning your children, which are considered your spouse's stepchildren, these stepchildren are still considered your spouse's immediate relatives. And in that case, they are principal applicants and you will still answer no. They're not dependent on your own green card case. Anyone who has their own petition and their own green card application will answer no to this question. Moving on. Include your biographic information. Select one box for your ethnicity and all applicable boxes for your race. Provide your height, your weight, eye color, and hair color. Moving on. Part 8 is a very long section, but it is one of the most important sections of this application. So please make sure that you read very carefully and answer all the questions to your best ability. The first question asks if you have ever been a member of any kind of organization, association, club, society, etc. Sorority or fraternity, a professional organization, a union, a club, even maybe a church. You will have to answer yes to this question and provide the name of that organization and your membership dates in this section. If you have been a member of more than 3 groups or organizations or churches, then you can also use the additional information page to fill in that information. Now, the following questions, I'm not going to go through them one by one, simply because you should really take the time and read each question carefully and answer it carefully. But I will point your attention to a few questions that people typically can get wrong. If you have ever been denied admission to the United States means if you have ever been actually at the border or you arrived to the United States and they denied your admission, you will have to answer yes. Let's say in our situation it's no. Have you ever been denied a visa to the United States? Now, this is asking if you have ever just applied for a visa overseas, for example, and your visa was denied. If, for instance, many years ago you applied for a tourist visa and it was denied, you can answer yes to this question. But keep in mind that anytime you answer yes, you will need to provide an explanation of the events and circumstances on the additional information page. The question was on page 10 in part 8, item number 15. That is, for instance, what you would write here. Next question asks if you have ever worked in the United States without authorization. Now, a lot of people are very scared to answer yes to this question if they have in fact worked in the United States illegally. All the questions must be answered truthfully. There are circumstances when you will be able to apply for a waiver and you may be forgiven if you meet certain criteria. What the U.S. immigration doesn't forgive is lying on your applications, because that is considered misrepresentation. And after you have been charged with misrepresentation, it is almost impossible to be approved for anything. Like I mentioned earlier, unauthorized employment is automatically forgiven for immediate relatives of U.S. citizens. So there's no reason that you should be lying in these questions. But let's say, for example, that Jane hasn't worked without authorization. Next question, which a lot of people can get wrong, is have you ever violated terms and conditions of your non-immigrant status? This includes unauthorized work and also visa overstay. And if you have answered yes to question 16, then you will also automatically have to answer yes to question 17. And we will use this additional information to explain our situation here. You can say, for example, I overstayed my most recent visa. Or you can include more detail if you believe that it will help your circumstance. Moving on, I will fast forward through the rest of these questions. Again, please read them very carefully and answer every question truthfully. If you have ever been a J non-immigrant exchange visitor and you were a subject to the 2-year foreign residence requirement, then you will have to answer yes to this question and then answer the consecutive questions 24, B, and C. If you have never been a J non-immigrant visa holder, then you will simply answer no and skip these 2 questions. Leave them blank. I do want to pay your attention to the question that asks about being arrested, cited, or charged with anything. Please keep in mind that citations like traffic tickets are also included here. So if you have ever gotten a traffic ticket, you will need to answer yes. Also keep in mind that if there were ever any convictions or charges that were dismissed, or if your record has been expunged, you still have to answer yes to any of these questions. And it says it right here. You have to answer yes even if your records were sealed or cleared. So please be careful when answering these questions. Moving on. Hopefully you will have to answer no to all of these questions that have to do with criminality. If you answer yes, you probably should not be doing this application on your own. Now we are at the public charge section of this form. I'm not going to go over the section in detail in this guide simply because I have a detailed video on how to answer these questions, and I will link that video in the top right corner of the screen as well as in the description box of this video. But in any case, if you are a family-based applicant, you will always answer yes to question 61 and will have to provide answers to the rest of these questions. Moving on, you should be reading every question carefully. Do not answer questions that do not apply to you. So for example, like in question 69B, for instance, you only need to answer this question if you answered yes to the previous part of this question. If you check every single box without looking, this might indicate to the officer reviewing your file that you didn't pay attention to your application. That may be viewed negatively towards your application. In part 9 of the application, you're asked about any accommodations. This refers if you need any accommodations because of your disabilities. You will need to describe them here and provide explanation why you need accommodations for this particular disability. Moving on to part 10, in most cases, you will probably say that you can read and understand English, and then you will provide your contact information here. If, for example, you are helping your relative apply for a green card and you're filling out this information for them, and your relative, for example, doesn't really speak English, say you are helping your parents to apply for a green card, then in that case, you can select box 1B and say that the interpreter read to me every question and my answer to every question in whatever your native language is, for example. And then also you can select that this same person or a different person also filled out this form for you. So again, if you're helping your parents, for example, then you will select this part and you will type in your name that you helped your parent apply for a green card. But let's say in our case, we can read and understand English and we filled in this information by ourselves. So once you provide your contact information, date, and sign your application after you print it out using a black pen. If you used anybody, even if it is the petitioner, for example, who interpreted the application or filled out this application, then you can provide their information in parts 11 and 12. Same applies to if you are helping your underage child fill out the information here in order for them to apply for a green card. You can also select boxes 1B and or 2, and then if your applicant is a child, doesn't have their own phone number, or if it's an elderly person, doesn't have their own phone number and email, you can still provide your phone number and email here as a preparer or interpreter, for example. Any children that are age 14 and older can and should be signing their application by themselves in this part. If the child is younger than age 14, then their parent or guardian can sign on their behalf. Next, you should not be filling out part 13 at all until you get to your interview. If your interview is waived, that is perfectly fine, but at the interview, if you do end up having it, the USCIS officer will help you fill out this part and sign it with you. That is basically it for this application. Once again, if you have questions on the part 8 of the form, the public charge section, please review the video guide that I will link in the description box of this video. If you found this video useful, I appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you guys in my next videos. Bye!